Now, so far we're doing well on this never process the file, never reprocess a file. But we need to have some logic up at the beginning that says before you load it, why don't you just check, mister, and see if it already exists. Okay. Well, this is cool. Okay, so I'm going to store a variable. You're just going to have to stick with me on this one for just a second. So has file been processed? And man, I say I made this in the scope of the for each loop. That's actually going to be okay. And it needs to be a Boolean, so it's a true or a false. And the idea is that if the file has been processed, we want to skip the load. If it has not been processed, then we want to perform the load. So let's do this. I told you this was going to get kind of complicated here. I need another object. This is how I would do it. It isn't the only one. So has file been processed? And you pass in to the stored procedure the file name, and it returns to you the has file been processed output variable. Okay, so this is now an output parameter. And we just do an if exists statement here. So if a row comes back from file process history where file name equal file name, then set has been processed equal 1, true. It has been processed. Else set has been equal 0, false, has not been processed. Okay. Let me make sure everybody understands what's going on here, because some of you guys may not have watched the output parameters and understand. Basically, the caller, the person who executes the application, this program that executes this stored procedure, is going to call the stored procedure, and it's going to pass in parameters. And the stored procedure is going to have an output parameter, meaning that it has sort of a return value, if you will, that is of a Boolean type. In SQL Server, we use the bit data type as a Boolean. And this if exists statement basically says if there is already a row in the file process history table that has this file name, then that file has already been processed. So set the has been processed param to true. Otherwise, it hasn't been processed. So I'm going to create this stored procedure, and I guess maybe from a previous video that had been created, so no need for that now. So I've created it. Now, I told you, we're building on all those things that we did in earlier videos. In Chapter 5, we talked about how to use the execute SQL task with an output parameter. And so check if file has been processed. And so we're going to wire up the execute SQL statement. Over here, we're going to use our learnitfirst.com. We're going to simply just say execute has file been processed with the file name equal question mark and the has file, what was the parameter name? Has file been processed equal question mark out. Okay, again, remember we are working with parameters. So if you have not seen how these parameters work, then you should go back to Chapter 5 and watch how to do output parameters and how all of this works. Right here is parameter 0, and here is parameter 1, their ordinal position. So I just say OK. I go to the parameter mapping screen, this horrible thing, and I say that the file name is an input parameter of an invarchar type, and that maps to parameter 0. What I mean by that, to go back to our statement, is that parameter 0, this guy right here, is going to be populated with the value of the file name variable. Okay. Now we have to map up parameter 1 with has file been processed. So we go add a new one and we say it's the user has file been processed, but this is an output parameter, hence the out next to the code. And it is of a type, you'd go up here and you'd start looking for Boolean, but it's really down at the bottom. And so I choose that and that becomes parameter 1. So what's going to happen with this, just so that you know, is after executing the stored procedure, SSIS will store the value of the output param at has file been processed in the SSIS variable at user has file been processed. And we're going to be able to make decisions based on that value. So here's we say okay. And so here's what we need to do. Now, you help me out here, because this is actually where it's going to get interesting and a little bit of complexity is going to come into play. If this is successful, do I want to load the text file or do I want to load it if it fails? Neither. I only want to load the text file if the file hasn't been processed, right? So success or failure or completion has nothing to do with whether or not load text file data comes into play. This is where I want to edit my precedence constraint, and I want to say, you know what, instead of this being a constraint, I want this built on an expression. If the value of the SSIS variable has file been processed equals false, make sure it validates. So if the value of that variable, remember the double equal is how you do tests for equality. If it's false, then I want to load up the text file. Now we're kind of needing a little bit of space here, so let's so you can see what's working. I didn't try to move it, goofball. Man, I'm not doing anything wrong. Stop pretending as though I am. That's all I wanted. I'll give you $5 if you'll straighten that line for me. All right, I owe you $5. Okay, so taking a look now, this is getting to be pretty deep now. We want to check if the file has already been processed. If it has not been processed, let's load it up. Then we'll archive it, and we want to audit in the table that it has been done. Are you satisfied? Is this going to do it? Because I'm not. You know why? Because now, what if the file hasn't been processed? What if the file has been processed? Don't I still want to move it to the archive folder? I do, don't I? So that I don't process it again. That was part of the thing. If it's been processed, let's move it to the archive folder. So what I want to really do is move this out so that this occurs regardless of whether this occurs. You see, right now, the archive folder bit only works if it was successfully loaded the data, the text file rows. It's not what I want. So I'm going to delete this, and I'm going to make a new sequence container inside my for each loop. And I'm going to drag these in here. So I'm going to just grab both of you, put them in here. And I'll just name this archive. Okay. So now, the next thing that I want to do is put this in a sequence container. So we'll get another sequence container. And I'll call this one process file. Come on, select. My thing just freeze? What's up? It's not letting me select that. It doesn't like the fact that I have this precedence constraint on it. So let's delete that and Um, wow. You're seeing the meltdown of SSIS here. I'm going to close out of the package and open it back up, and hopefully that will cause it to play nice again, and it seems to. There, we didn't get it to go in. There we go. And so now I'm going to set this to be completion. Let me come back up here and I'll explain what I've done and why. Okay. So in our process file sequence here, we're checking to see if the file has been processed. If it has not been processed, we're loading the text file and auditing the file name. And you know what we can do? We can go over here to the description, only add text file, only process text file, only load text file rows only if text file has never been processed. And I can tell it up here at the top to show that annotation. Instead of as needed, I can say always. Okay, so I want to show that here, the constraint description. And what that's going to do is add this little line right here so that we can tell without having to look up the definition of that expression that the only time it's going to load the text file is if the text file has never been processed. Now, by making this an on completion constraint after process file, this says, okay, I don't care whether you've processed the file or didn't. Now we're going on to the archive procedure. So these sequence containers can really make they can make things that otherwise wouldn't be possible to do seem rather trivial here. Okay. So let's go back to our project documents. We're kind of running long on this. Once we've processed, we're moving it to an archive, and now we're never reprocessing a file. Okay, let's just verify that. Okay, let's go to our import data. We have our files. Our tables are empty. So let's run this one time. And let's see if everything works. We got a bunch of green here. So let's see, did it actually move it to the archive? It did. So I'm moving it back, resetting. And let's see, are there rows in the tables? Yes, sirree, there are. And you can see we've already processed those two files. So let's run the package again without resetting the data. And this time I'm going to drill into these so you can actually see them. I'll move this down and expand. That way when we hit execute on these, you'll be able to see them executing and see green or yellow or which ones were skipped in the package. So I'm going to run this again. So it's checking to see if the file has been processed. Notice that it did not run the load and audit because the file had already been processed, and it still did the archive bits for us. So it did the archiving. I'm going to reset. And it did not reload the data. So there were 8 rows and 2 rows. Let's do that again. And now there's still 8 rows and 2 rows in the table. So we have accomplished everything on this list except number 1. Now let's come back in the next video and talk about using WQL as a way to do this.